I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our classic Disney podcast, in which we'll be talking about animated Disney movies made during the lifetime of Walt Disney himself.
Which people say, I'm not sure which people, but I've seen it written somewhere fairly official, I think, is the golden age of Disney. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. We shall see.
When cartoon animation was first invented, widely distributed in the early part of the 20th century, there's a definite tendency in it, or even an unfailing pattern in it, to be mucking about to music rather than creating a coherent narrative with plot and characterization. You can see this very clearly in such old animation as Betty Boop, the skeletons and ghosts in prison cartoon that Mikey's watching and Luffy's talking to, and early things with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and people like that. The sort of cartoon that was so effectively parodied on The Simpsons, with such things as Steamboat Itchy and That Happy Cat. And this mucking about to music tendency, I think, is why people said to Walt Disney when he was going to produce the first feature-length animated film in 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, well, you can't produce a full-length animated thing. Nobody's going to sit and watch that. And Walt Disney had said, by way of riposte, well, I can, because this one's going to have proper plot and characterization and isn't going to be just mucking about to music. And in that way, Disney was certainly a trailblazer and paved the way for the future of animation. Of course, all these things are transitionary, and as we've been reminded recently and have been discussing while watching many of the early Disney animated feature movies, although Walt seems to have realised the importance of including plot and characterization in full-length animated movies, he still seems to take it as read that you have to have mucking about to music as part of a piece of animation, which I think is why I did tend to shy away slightly from older Disney movies when I was young, and it is the aspect of them that has mitigated the things we do like about them as we've watched and discussed them recently.
Another symptom of Snow White being a transition piece is Snow White's voice. Adriana Caselotti, an actress and singer whose career Walt Disney ruined, as he would many other people's. Which brings me back to Betty Boop, whom you mentioned. She is perhaps the prime example of cartoon girls, women having a high voice. Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse too, of course, and so does Adriana Caselotti Snow White. She has rather an annoying voice, but Walt Disney didn't see it that way, and evidently it didn't occur to him that Snow White shouldn't talk like this, being a cartoon character.
Yes, it really is stuck between being neither one thing nor the other, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and I do find it interesting to watch rather than enjoyable. As he intended, Walt put in plot and characterization in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but it's very, very little and far between. He really has only adapted the bare bones of a plot from Snow White's original story, and occasionally we cut back to see the plot. Here's the wicked stepmother talking to the woodsman, here's the dwarfs discovering who Snow White is, here's the wicked queen making the poison apple. But in between, and for most of the length of the film, it really is a lot of mucking about to music, be it dancing around with the Seven Dwarfs, or the Seven Dwarfs washing up for dinner at the trough, or the Seven Dwarfs doing their mining, or Snow White cleaning and singing back at the palace at the beginning, or all that horrendous mucking about with the animals that Snow White does, including the rather unsanitary cleaning of the dwarf's cottage, with all the animals wiping all their dirty, flea-ridden parts all over the place, and then Snow White objects to one of them licking a plate.
No, put them in the tub.
So on the whole, to a modern audience, or certainly me, I think that movie is rather boring, but very interesting as a step, as a transition piece.
I think I'm about to repeat myself now. I said something along these lines in our Disney Renaissance podcast, which is to do with the elements of Snow White that Disney himself and the successors at the Walt Disney Production Company carried forward. Walt Disney himself has said on my DVD of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that Snow White was the story he felt most interested in and able to adapt because of the tropes that would allow him to do the kind of storytelling that he liked and thought children ought to like: the romance, the goofy characters, and the villain. And I'm sure I've talked about how things like The Little Mermaid take those three tropes and construct their basic story out of the same thing. He says this on what they call a commentary by Walt Disney, which is scraps of bits and bobs that he's said all patched together and dubbed over the movie, and I haven't got any further into listening to it than that. But that one I do think was worth listening to, and is very interesting, and that is one of the aspects that you see in Disney up until this century, probably to this day, although I've given up now on watching Disney. And things like the style of song and the style of princess dress and the kinds of voices other than Snow White's that Disney decide they like can all be seen and heard being used very effectively in later Disney movies, along with other ingredients that are perhaps better than all the mucking about in Snow White.
One of the interesting things about Snow White was that the Queen, the Wicked Stepmother, did start a couple of Disney villain trends, namely having an evil bird companion. Certainly Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty has one of those, and so does Jafar in Aladdin. And also falling from a height to her death at the end. Something that, for a reason that will soon be discussed, Disney movies did shy away from for a bit, killing off the main villain. But it's certainly a tendency we have seen turn up in other Disney movies. The villain falls to its death, such as Gaston in Beauty and the Beast, Frollo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame,
Mother Gothel in Tangled, and one or two others that we'll talk about in this podcast.
There was one bit of Snow White that made us genuinely laugh, involving Dopey locking up their days fine from the diamond mine, or gem mine as it is, it's not only diamond. And of course, what does he do when he's locked the door? He hangs the key on a hook next to it, having gone, "Oh, I've forgotten to hang up the key," which we weren't expecting and which did amuse us, because it is a very dopey thing to do, but one presumes the other dwarfs must be in on it. They must know that Dopey locks up the treasure, and someone has put that hook there for him to put the key on.
Yes, when I laughed, it was at the expense of all the dwarfs, really, and of course Dopey is the one to perform that joke because he is Dopey, and it's funny as if he does it.
One thing I knew it was important to bear in mind while watching Snow White, and indeed all the early Disney movies, was to think about how stunning and amazing and groundbreaking the animation would have been at the time. We're all very blasé about it now. We're blasé about all sorts of things that they can create as forms of entertainment, but the contemporary audience would have been absolutely spellbound by the animation effects, including things like the Wicked Queen's magic mirror, the mist and the face, and all the animation that went into all these terribly boring mucking about to music sequences. So perhaps not a bad time to be transitionary, really. Amaze people with the animation, but also show them, yes, you can have plot and characterization in these things as well. The second full-length animated Disney movie was Pinocchio, which was released in 1940, and it does have some of those aspects of being transitionary, but also it does have more plot and characterization than Snow White, and is definitely a step in the right direction. Things in that, like looking at Pinocchio through the goldfish bowl with the different reflection effects and the underwater bubbles and movement and things at the end when they're going to find Monstro, must have been absolutely spellbinding at the time and are extremely well done. And there's more to bolster them in this movie, and I have always enjoyed Pinocchio. As I discovered when I found and watched a VHS of it one evening while babysitting, it's kind of disjointed and the sequence of events doesn't really follow on one to another neatly, but then it does have more of a plot and a sequence of events than Snow White, so there we are, more transition.
I remember you trying to tell me about what happened in Pinocchio, which was quite challenging, really, and you were talking about when he had gone to Pleasure Island to get turned into a jackass unbeknown to himself, and I knew that he was a puppet who'd been brought to life by a wish, and I couldn't quite think how he ended up there, so I said, well, why does he go there? And you said, well, this sort of fox tells him to go there, which is true, and this fox's name is Honest John, and he persuades Pinocchio to do a couple of things that people are going to pay him for, and again, it's starting to sound very weird if somebody tries to explain it. The point is that Pinocchio is supposed to prove himself brave, loyal, and good, something like that, the blue fairy says, who grants the wish, to become a real boy. And on his first day of being animate and sentient, Geppetto packs him off to school by himself. So of course Pinocchio gets mixed up with Honest John and sent off to be an actor in the marionette show and a jackass on Pleasure Island, and of course helping Pinocchio and doing his level best to be his conscience, as the blue fairy has tasked him with, is Jiminy Cricket, who I think is a very great asset to that film and has a lot to do with it being better than Snow White.
They brought in to voice Jiminy an actor and singer and all-round entertainer called Cliff Edwards, and they asked him back to voice Jiminy in various little skits and safety videos and bits in other pieces of animation, Disney animation, for the rest of his life, which certainly went into the 70s.
I have heard him described, I think on one of the special features on the DVD, as Disney's first celebrity voice. And yet he's still uncredited. All these actors we've talked about so far are uncredited. But I was talking about Cliff anyway, who's brilliant. He says the lines just exactly right. He got a laugh out of us when he said, what does an actor want with a conscience anyway? That's a very clever line, very well delivered. You can hear the melody to When You Wish Upon a Star over that little castle, look at Disney animation and all the VHSs as we used to have, because at the time Disney were very pleased with that song, felt that it epitomised the kind of ethos that they wanted to project to their child audiences, despite the way they were screwing people over behind the scenes themselves. I don't know the original story of Pinocchio, I've never read it, but a very funny thing that somebody said on one of these special features is that Jiminy Cricket featured only very briefly in that story, and what happened to him was that Pinocchio crushed him with a mallet. And there is a bit of homage to that when Honest John's cat sidekick, whom I have mentioned in our Warner Brothers podcast as being the only surviving voice work of Mel Blanc with the hiccup that they kept of all his lines, is after Jiminy with a mallet and does that thing where you try to hit something and miss and you end up hitting somebody else, in this case, Honest John.
The other strong voice performance in that movie, which carries us through the whole thing alongside Cliff as Jiminy, is Dick, or Dickie Jones, as Pinocchio. And he was a very lucky child star working for Disney in that he never signed with Disney. If you read his biography on Wikipedia or wherever, you can read all sorts of interesting things he did as a young actor and singer and rodeo trick performer. And he must have recorded the voice of Pinocchio when he was about 12 and went on to appear in lots of other things and retired when he was about 40 and lived happily for almost 50 years in retirement and had a wife and 4 children. And that's a very good life to have and a very good way to avoid Walt Disney getting his claws into you and messing up your career and your life. Pinocchio as a character obviously has to have a lot of naivety and wonder about the world, and yet also a lot of heart and goodness shining through, and I think they very much chose the right voice and the right performance to bring that across. When Pinocchio's swearing to Jiminy that he's not going to go off to join the theatre, when Jiminy's pulled him aside and said, remember what I told you about temptation? Well, that's him, Honest John. Pinocchio's like, oh yes, of course, I'll go to school. And then a few seconds later, what's he doing? Going off with Honest John and blithely going, goodbye, Jiminy. And then later, when he's in the cage and the blue fairy turns up and you get the famous nose growing scene when he tries to lie his way out of it, the voice work effectively takes us on his journey there towards being more honest and resolving to do better in future. But then, as is often the case, he has to make another mistake first, almost immediately, with the same person.
I find that very comical. They're going home from the marionette show. Jiminy's obviously thinking, oh, phew, I've saved Pinocchio from the machinations of honest John. He won't do anything like that again. He's right behind me. And then, of course, he's not. And when Jiminy comes back and finds him, he's going off with honest John, singing the same high fiddly-dee song as he was earlier. And quite frankly, I know the feeling. You think, oh, that young person's not going to do that again. And then 5 seconds later, they're doing it.
One of the things we found very amusing about Pinocchio was Geppetto and how absolutely nuts it is. There are some stunning animation sequences of all the clocks he's made, which have some very mad little scenes for when the chimes go off, like the drunk staggering out of the town hall and the man trying to cut off the turkey's head and not managing, and the little boy getting his bare bottom smacked by his mother. And he's a terrible pet abuser, isn't he, Geppetto, making the not-yet-brought-to-life Pinocchio kick his cat Figaro, and manipulating Figaro into going to close the window as they're going to bed. He's a very strange, mad, and suspect character, Geppetto, and just the sort of person who might accidentally end up getting swallowed by a whale while looking for his missing son.
Which is one of those very disjointed bits. You were telling me about that when you'd watched this video and saying he wasn't in the sea or anything. The last time we see him, he's off looking for Pinocchio on land, and Figaro and Cleo the goldfish are back home being told you're not allowed your dinner until I find Pinocchio. And then the next time we see any of them, they're all three inside Monstro the whale, which doesn't make an awful lot of sense. But it does facilitate the denouement in which Pinocchio doesn't listen to Jiminy, but listens to his actual conscience. And what I take away from the film more than anything is, if you're going to listen to your conscience, it has to be the voice inside you, and you have to really want to listen to it, and nobody else can do it for you. Another line I like of Jiminy's, of course, is when he's saying, now, Pinocchio, I don't think this is a very good idea, it's very dangerous. And then when Pinocchio's tying a rock to himself to keep anchored under the sea in the middle of all this, oh, I don't know about this, Jiminy says, tie it good and tight now, because he knows perfectly well himself that it's the right thing to do, and Pinocchio will do it, and he, Jiminy, will help.
I always think that's one occasion when it's very useful to have a donkey's tail, so thank goodness he's grown one. It's a thought-provoking film in many ways about paths you can take in life, and one thing that parents should take away from it is, for goodness sake, don't just send your child out into the world unprepared. Like, walk with him to school on the first day and introduce him to the teacher, then perhaps he'll have a better foothold. Later in 1940 they released Fantasia, which we haven't watched for at least 30 years and certainly don't intend to. I remember watching it when I was little and absolutely resenting the fact that it existed, because it really is a regression to mucking about to music in several different sequences, the most famous one being Mickey Mouse and the Sorcerer's Apprentice. But talking about paths in life, that's the wrong path, I think, for Walt Disney animated features to go along, and they do realise that eventually, but as we'll say in a few moments, it takes them a little while. The fourth animated movie is Dumbo, which we did watch in our recent watch-through, and it's not a complete continuation along the path of just mucking about to music, as it does have thought and characterisation, but we didn't enjoy it very much, did we?
No. Famously, Dumbo doesn't have any lines. He has the occasional hiccup and squeal and things like that. Most of the action, though, is driven by a mouse called Timothy, who strikes me as an attempt to recreate Jiminy Cricket, which I do think is a mistake. If you've done something very, very, very well, you really can't replicate it. You need to try and do something else very, very, very well, which Walt Disney will come to do. So there's that aspect of it. Those two main characters really don't have the dynamic of Pinocchio and Jiminy, one because he doesn't speak and the other because he's a pale imitation of the original. The plot doesn't make an awful lot of sense. The thing that everyone knows is that Dumbo ends up making it in the circus by flying. And the build up to that is that his mother has been put in the clink, as Timothy calls it, for being a mad, dangerous elephant. And actually, that's quite a satirical piece of look at the crap that happens in the world. She's just trying to protect Dumbo from all the people who are laughing at him. And then, as soon as the people appear to be in any danger, oh, she's a crazy animal, she's dangerous, we have to lock her up away from the people. So perhaps that's the most interesting, poignant thing one can take away from Dumbo.
And as a continuation of that, it's true that if you're lucky enough, like Dumbo, to find a way to become successful, rich and famous, or just rich enough, you can do whatever you want, like have your private trailer and let your mother out, and then she'll sit there waving at you.
So this is Dumbo's motivation, and he's working as a clown in this jumping out of the burning building sequence, which they don't seem to have rehearsed him for, so of course he freaks out and things don't go as planned. And so he's very down on his luck and accidentally gets drunk, discovers he can fly, and then suddenly that's the end. It's all rather rushed.
And I do think we're back to the realms of Snow White in terms of mucking about to music sequences. That drunken sequence with the pink elephants is far too long. You were looking at the runtime and saying, is there really only 15 minutes left? Got to discover he can fly and everything, and all the bit with the crows. And 7 or 8 of those 15 minutes were the pink elephant bubble drunken sequence. And the other big step back to the silly animation mucking about to music I was really struck by was the circus train, which really was becoming anthropomorphic in its silly journey sequences, and is much more the sort of thing you'd expect to see in something like a Fantasia than a proper plot-driven Disney film. The train puffing up the hill, can I make it, can I make it, I can make it, I can make it. It's an inappropriate place to have that sort of sequence.
Really, I do think it loses its way with Dumbo. One reason is that, too much mucking about, not enough plot. It's a step back, and they're going to take a few more in the years to come. And also, Disney discovers he likes making children sad by showing what a lovely mother the young animal protagonist has, and then taking her away. And of course, as everyone knows, he took the next step with Bambi, which was released the following year in 1942. And other than that, I don't really want to talk about Bambi. I can't watch Bambi.
Bambi is something I know we watched when we were young and definitely don't want to watch again, because it's not worth the emotional distress.
But an interesting thing about Bambi is that the fallout from that very cruel decision, where they would make every child who went to the cinema cry and feel miserable and awful, of course people objected. They said, look at what you've done to our children, they're quivering heaps of misery. So, of course, Disney and friends take that to mean, oh, we can never have a character death ever again. Although there may be some exceptions to that. We're going to mention at least one villain who definitely dies. But my prime example is from the Disney slump, The Fox and the Hound, from 1981, when they were really in the doldrums. This other dog character really needed to get run over by a train and killed for the plot, and for 10 minutes or so we assume that's what happened, but then suddenly there he is with a couple of bandages on his legs as cheerful as anything. And that's another thing that the Renaissance really fixed, having characters die if the plot needed them to. Hello, Mufasa.
Bambi is number 5 on the list of animated Disney movies, and then really, the next lot are mucking about to music pretty much exclusively. I say this from having seen only clips of them, but they've got things like Donald Duck mucking about. I mean, that's not supposed to be in proper animated Disney movies, is it? It's supposed to be adaptations of other stories, fairy stories and so on. And the next number on the list that isn't one of those, I think, is number 11, Ichabod and Mr. Toad, 1949, which I haven't seen.
I've seen it in the school hall at the end of term, and the only thing I can really remember is that I've subsequently seen adaptations of Sleepy Hollow and thought, oh, that's that thing I saw in the school hall. I seem to remember it's a guy doing a sort of rhyming narrative to the animation.
Now that is interesting and probably is a bit of a transition from those three caballeros and so on back to proper animated full-length Disney movies. Some of those from that section we don't want to talk about do have kind of live-action presentation and animation, and a fully narrated verse movie is the step back to doing it properly, which they did with number 12 on the list, Cinderella, which was released in 1950. And this was one that was given to Rosie as a present when she was little on VHS, and we always enjoyed watching. And when we watched the DVD a few days ago in our classic Disney watch-through, it was the one I enjoyed by far the most.
Me too, and I expected to enjoy it the most. You were interested in me telling you about when I was a child getting this video as a present and watching it and thinking, oh, it's the same sort of thing. It's obviously in the same group as Beauty and the Beast and The Little Mermaid, which we'd been enjoying at the time. And as a small child, I really didn't notice any differences in style or values and ideology.
What I particularly like, and have always particularly liked about Cinderella, is really the mice, principally Gus, and the king. The king is one of these Disney movie characters who's from a very funny mould, which is the kind of blustering, pompous, in many ways childish, but in a position of power, Disney father. Characters from the Renaissance that are amusing in this way include the Sultan in Aladdin, and Maurice from Beauty and the Beast, although he's not exactly in a position of power, but he is from that same mould. And there's certainly another one in another film from classic Disney times that we're going to talk about soon. But he's very funny, the king in Cinderella, with the Grand Duke as his kind of foil to react to him and be scared of getting his head cut off. King throwing his crown out of the window and throwing the swords around, going, I am patient, when obviously he really isn't. And it's very extreme and very funny and very amusing for children and adults alike, I should think.
There are two named mice, Jacques and Octavius, but for short we'll call you Gus. And it was only the other day, watching this movie, that it occurred to me, perhaps Gus is my favourite Disney character because he got a lot of laughs out of me. This is a question I've heard put to people on YouTube, and I've thought, not sure what I'd say to that, but I think now I would say Gus. Not only is he very funny, but he's also really cute. And he's got a good dynamic with Jacques, who knows exactly what's going on and tries to help Cinderella and tries to keep Gus out of danger from Lucifer the cat. And Gus really has no idea what's going on and very willingly and enthusiastically follows Jacques around in this bubble of blissful ignorance.
We always used to laugh about, ooh, beads! Pretty, when we were little, and we still do now. And of course, Jack and Gus go through all this terrible strife getting the sash and the beads away from Lucifer, and they go into the lovely dress for Cinderella so she can go to the ball, and the big reveal happens. She comes in and sees it and is so happy and surprised, and of course Gus says, "Happy birthday!" He hasn't picked up what's going on at all. He thought they were making her a birthday surprise.
No, says Jack.
Hilarious stuff.
I rather like Gus's summary of what Jack has just explained is going on at the end when they have to get the key to Cinderella so she can let herself out of her room where her wicked stepmother has locked her in while the shoe is being tried on. He does manage to pick up the key words, doesn't he? Do, kiki, quick. But I don't think he's quite grasped exactly what's happening, although he does realise it's Cinderella's flipper, though not when to keep quiet about it.
And we've always liked the bit where he sees all the stairs they've got to climb with the key. Oh, absolutely wonderful. And even those lengthier animation sequences with the mice and Lucifer are okay and not distracting and don't make you think, ooh, this is a bit of a regression, hiding under the teacups and waving the hat through the hole in the wall and things, because they're relevant enough to the wider plot and they don't take too long.
Walt really gets that out of his system with Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, of course, and all the magic, but of course that's extremely relevant to the plot. Cinderella herself is voiced by Eileen Woods, who has a very sensible young woman's voice. The characterization of Lucifer is very accurate, isn't it? He's the one animal who's come into the family with Lady Tremaine and Drusilla and Anastasia. And of course, being a cat, he's an evil animal and he antagonizes the mice, who are Cinderella's friends, and Bruno, the dog, whom we see with the horse, who's the other main animal character in the narrated beginning. Cinderella and her father were happy together before he died and all that. Bruno and the horse are there. And Lucifer is in the arms of being stroked by Lady Tremaine when she comes into the narrative. And Lucifer's just a complete jerk, isn't he? Scratching Bruno on the muzzle so that Bruno will bark and then going meow and looking completely victimised, smiling evilly when Cinderella takes Bruno outside, and of course she's really projecting her frustrations onto the animals, saying to Bruno, I know it isn't easy, but at least we should all try to get along together.
It didn't used to annoy me how passive Cinderella is as a character in this terrible situation, but it does now. She's not trying to change her life and break out of her shackles, metaphorical shackles, by doing anything very proactive to get these stupid women out of her house or anything. But I do think the very least she could do is be a bit canny about how much she shows, how much she gives away in front of her wicked stepmother. She could very easily just not be begging for permission to go to the ball, go off and put her mother's dress on, and go herself. And never mind if she can't go in the carriage with them. And then later, Cinderella herself gives away the fact that, she was the one who was dancing with the prince, with her mooning around and going off to get ready. She's her own worst enemy, really. Obviously, we can't expect in 1950 a female lead in the vein of Merida and Rapunzel, who are very keen to take charge of their own lives as more modern women for modern audiences. But I think Cinderella is particularly annoyingly passive and really doesn't do herself any favours. Talking about Lady Tremaine, the wicked stepmother, reminds me that at this point we're really getting into the pool of voice actors that at this point Disney himself does keep using. As we've mentioned in our previous Disney podcast, they do get rather lazy with their pool of actors after Walt Disney's death. Just stick Phil Harris in as Thomas O'Malley in The Aristocats. It doesn't matter, even though he sounds like a bear rather than a cat. But you do find from this point on, during the 50s and 60s Disney movies, common actors that do crop up again and again. The stepmother, of course, is the voice of Maleficent. Fairy godmother exact voice turned up for an appropriate character in Lady and the Tramp. And there were several voice actors from Alice in Wonderland, which is the next one after Cinderella, which we talked about at great length on the previous podcast, who do turn up in a lot of Disney movies from around that time. Bill Thompson, who played the White Rabbit, got a lot more work from Disney, as we may mention as we go through the next few films. Sterling Holloway, after his performance as the Cheshire Cat, as was mentioned last time, was heard over and over again. And an interesting thing about Dumbo was that there was an early, quite small role for Sterling Holloway in it as the Stork, delivering Dumbo at the beginning of the movie, which was quite a good role for his younger voice, and certainly led on to a lot of work for him.
Before we move on from Cinderella, I must just mention that Lucifer is chased out of a very high window and so falls from a height, like Snow White's stepmother, and I did promise I would tell you about the villains that happened to. They don't specify whether or not he dies from the fall. You said you thought he probably broke a couple of legs.
Yes, I thought it would have been quite good to see Lady Tremaine and her daughters and Lucifer with a bandage on a couple of his legs living in a smaller house at the end of the movie. And Cinderella and the prince and Bruno and the horse are going to use Cinderella's house, as it really is, as their weekend cottage. But I guess they just wanted us to fill that in for ourselves. Then after Alice in Wonderland came Peter Pan in 1953, in which Bill Thompson, the White Rabbit, had a pretty major role as Mr. Smee. He was fourth billed in that one, after Bobby Driscoll as Peter Pan, Catherine Beaumont as Wendy Darling, and Hans something as Captain Hook and Mr. Darling.
I don't know how much the decision to make Peter Pan had to do with Walt wanting to reuse Catherine Beaumont while he could, perhaps something to do with it. And I guess he was pretty keen on Bobby Driscoll for a short while. They really modelled the character design of Peter on Bobby Driscoll. He's most certainly got the same nose, cute snub nose sort of a thing.
He's Bobby Driscoll mixed with an elf, isn't he?
Yes.
Which I guess is the idea of Peter Pan, the eternally youthful boy that Walt wanted Bobby Driscoll to be, and a sprite who's mischievous and plays the panpipes.
I want to like Peter Pan, and I want to like Disney's Peter Pan. I think it's a very good, very effective design, and I think Bobby Driscoll plays the character brilliantly. And if you forget about how much of it's actually complete nonsense, or if I do, I'm left with a very favourable impression of a highly spirited, rather exciting for girls like Wendy kind of guy. And I'd like to be able to tell you all about the interesting comparisons between Disney's Peter Pan and Fox's Peter Pan and the Pirates, and how the designs of the latter are very deliberately different from Disney, so we won't look at it and go, "Ooh, Disney," but still equally valid and evocative of what the whole characters and mythos are supposed to be. And if I just remember the bits I do like, it seems quite surprising if I come back to it and realise, oh, actually, this is all nonsense. Neither one of us liked the book when we read it. It's got a certain amount of story that may make a certain amount of sense, but it's all wrapped up in some very peculiarly expressed, rather abstract ideas, I think, is the main problem with it.
And in the Disney movie, they took that with its problems and adapted it rather badly, I thought. There's a lot of very silly sequences, like Smee shaving the seagull's bottom and thinking that Captain Hook's head has come off. And we commented that it was getting too cartoony with all the stuff with Hook running in and out of the crocodile's mouth and so on. And of course, that is a factor of, we can't kill anyone, we can't kill the villain. Hook just has to run away from the crocodile being chased by it, but it can't eat him, and we have to make a joke of him being in its mouth at various points.
What should have happened was that he fell from a height, from the mast probably, into the crocodile's mouth. If only someone had explained to Walt Disney the difference between killing a villain and killing the protagonist's mother. You'd have thought it was obvious.
It turns out at the end of the Peter Pan movie that it was all Wendy's stupid dream. You could interpret it. And John and Michael were fast asleep in bed and had absolutely no idea about the Neverland adventure. And that makes them very fortunate, in my opinion.
I think we do have to mention Tinkerbell. I think arguably Tinkerbell is something that J.M. Barrie got right, did very well. She's not the kind of fairy that you might think Disney would really go for. And in fact, nowadays, in all that Pixie Hollow nonsense they make, I think they've done kind of a 180 on her character. But really in the book and in this Disney adaptation, she's one of those wicked sprites who are very Machiavellian and perhaps don't actively want to harm people, but don't care if they do, although she does actively want to harm Wendy, as do the mermaids, because everybody wants a piece of Peter, including Tiger Lily. And as I was saying, the way that he's designed, characterised, voiced by Bobby Driscoll, I kind of buy that. I think he's not exactly the spirit of childhood, as Mrs. Darling believes. To me, he seems more like the spirit of discovering your sexuality, quite frankly. Of course, they really do go for that, don't they, in that film that they made this century that Michael Goldenberg wrote the script for and I thought was terrible.
Yes, rather than the boy who never grew up, Peter Pan has come to be the boy who is constantly on the brink of puberty. And by going off with him and adventuring with him, girls like Wendy are taking the step into adulthood, into being a grown-up woman. Peter Pan kind of escorts you over the threshold out of childhood, but never goes over it himself.
So there are some really very interesting things one can take away from Peter Pan and that do come across in the Disney movie, because what it does do well, it does do very well. And as I was saying, you can sort of forget the nonsense, but then when you come back to it, it's rather disappointing.
The 15th full-length Disney animated feature is Lady and the Tramp from 1955, which was in our watch-through in preparation for this podcast, but I was surprised how much I did enjoy it. That one has several actors from the Disney pool, including Bill Thompson as Jock the Scottish dog, and another dog who's got a kind of bad fake Cockney accent like Smee, and in a starring role as Lady, Barbara Luddy, who you can hear sounding deliberately more matronly quite soon afterwards in Sleeping Beauty as Merryweather, and then 20 years later, sounding definitely older, as the Mother Rabbit in Robin Hood, which we talked about at great length on our Robin Hood podcast. I didn't like in Lady and the Tramp the bit with the beaver, where Lady and the Tramp went to the zoo and got the beaver to bite off Lady's muzzle, and he was trying to make his dam, and it was all very stupid, and it wasn't exactly mucking about to music, but it was mucking about for a long time, which unforgivably took up too much of the film. But I thought the rest of it was all right. I particularly remembered, from having watched it before several years ago, the early part about getting a new pet, getting Lady, and the humans and the pet adjust to each other, and it soon becomes clear that the pet is in charge. She's just going to sleep in our bed for one night, and then, of course, 6 months later, she's still doing it. And then the audience does feel very bad for Lady when the couple are having a baby and start completely ignoring and neglecting the dog. A dog is for life, not just until you discover you're pregnant. So again, there's some useful life messages to take away from the film.
One point, Darling, which is the name of the wife, not really, but that's how Lady, and therefore the audience, knows her, says to Lady, "No walk today." And I'm like, no walk today, you have to walk your dog. And if you can't do it yourself because you're tired or whatever, get someone else to do it.
I was saying, you've got plenty of money. I bet one of the neighbourhood kids would like a regular dog walking job until you've had your baby and have settled into a new way of life and can incorporate the dog back into it.
Fortunately, that is shown to happen very soon after the baby arrives. Jim Dear lifts Lady to look into the crib and introduce her properly, and she likes the baby and protects him from rats and things. Until Jim Dear and Darling naff off and leave the house and the baby and the fish and the canary in the care of Aunt somebody or other, who brings along 2 Siamese cats who are in it for just one scene, famously sing a song about what mischief makers they are, doesn't take proper care of Lady, puts this muzzle on her, ties her up in the kennel, and fails to notice when a rat gets into the baby's room.
She's the worst house-sitter, babysitter, pet-sitter in the world, Darling's aunt. Bringing these 2 Siamese cats in the house when they're going to obviously antagonise the dog and want to eat the goldfish and the canary, and they very nearly do kill the goldfish and the canary, but Lady saves them, of course, and 2 cats could well smother the baby. At least Aunt Thingamy does come to collect Lady from the pound, probably very grudgingly, and sticks her in the kennel in the rain afterwards. But I was saying, when Darling and Jim Dear were coming home, oh, thank goodness those 2 are home. Well, that shows you what an absolutely irresponsible person to have in charge of the house this aunt character is, because these 2 idiots have come home, and it's a relief because things are going to work out now.
A very different role for that lady from the fairy godmother, but that's the character whose voice she does in Lady and the Tramp, as mentioned earlier.
What they do have in common, I suppose, is they're both kind of dotty old women. But with the fairy godmother, it's comedic, she doesn't notice Cinderella's dress is horrible. Whereas in Lady and the Tramp, she's dottily causing absolute havoc in this household she's supposed to be looking after.
Lady and the Tramp very famously go on one of those doggy dates that you get in some films, such as Beethoven's Second and Look Who's Talking Now. They're always very good fun. And the most famous thing is the spaghetti kiss, of course. In that whole sequence, the two people working in Tony's restaurant are lavishing attention on these two dogs out the back, and you said, have you got any human customers?
Yeah, Tony brings out his accordion and is singing and telling his worker, bring them out spaghetti and meatballs. They're going to go out of business at that rate. I did think the rat in the nursery shouldn't have wanted to have quite such a savage fight with the tramp, a dog of his size. The rat is scared of Lady, as he should be, and he only manages to get past her because she's on a chain and can't reach him, and Tramp is more than twice the size of Lady, I would think. But they end up having quite a savage fight, and of course they have to for the plot. The stupid old woman will think Tramp was attacking the baby, and they have to have the rush to rescue him from the pound. Once Lady has revealed that no, he was in here killing a rat, you stupid people. And then they have that very unnecessary bit where they want us to worry for about 30 seconds that Trusty the dog, who is Lady's other friend and neighbour along with Jock the Scottish dog, has been killed by the falling dog pound wagon. But of course, as we see very soon afterwards, when we meet Lady and the Tramp's 4 children, Uncle Trusty comes round with a leg in bandages. That was really very unnecessary and not really relevant to the plot, and would have been better if that bit of false jeopardy had not been included.
I suppose, in a similar way to Cinderella being a refined princess movie following Snow White, Lady and the Tramp is a refined animal movie following Dumbo, given that we don't want anything to do with Bambi. And in fact, I think they're not going to hit much of a winning formula again with animal movies until The Lion King.
16th on the list is Sleeping Beauty, which was released in 1959. As I mentioned, Barbara Luddy is in that one as Merryweather the Fairy. Flora the Fairy, you can hear her voice as the fairy godmother and Aunt whatever she's called. And as I also mentioned, Cinderella's wicked stepmother is in that one as Maleficent, the main villain. Played very similarly because it is a very similar role.
More of a magical than a domestic version of the same character, really.
Again, in that one, I like the silly, blustering, shouty father, another king in this case, not the kind of main king, King Stephen, Aurora's father, but King Hubert, Prince Philip's father.
And in fact, Stephen, when he gets into a bit of an argument with him, calls him, "Why, you unreasonable, blustering old windbag!" And you say, yes, that's the character model.
That's right, he summed it up perfectly, didn't he? I always particularly like the bit where Philip comes to tell his father, I'm not going to marry Aurora, I'm going to marry this peasant girl I've just met. Of course, we know it's actually the same person, but they don't know that yet. And King Hubert gets very into the blustery windbag mould for that. And my particular favourite bit is where he gets into a bit of despair and goes, "You're joking." Philip shakes his head. So then he turns to the horse, isn't he? And the horse solemnly shakes his head as well. Always made me laugh. That a nice little surreal moment.
Not until this stage do they think of naming the prince. Snow White's prince and Cinderella's prince are hardly even characters. They're just goals for the protagonists.
And of course they named him Prince Philip after our Prince Philip, because that was apparently the only prince name anyone could think of.
Now, we both enjoy Sleeping Beauty. I like the princess ones, even though I'm not very princessy myself. I enjoy watching them. But there are some issues with this movie, and Walt Disney knew that there were issues with this movie, and I've read that it didn't go down terribly well at the time. And he said, right then, no more fairy tales, which I think was a mistake, as The Little Mermaid proves by starting the Disney Renaissance many years later. The main cause of the problems is that they hadn't really finalised the script before they started recording the voices and putting the movie together. One of the things I've read is that they were drafting a script where there was some sort of complicated scavenger hunt going on that would lead to Philip and Aurora meeting in the woods, which doesn't happen. They just happen to be there and manage to meet and sing Once Upon a Dream and fall in insta-love.
I don't like all that animal sequence that leads up to that. The owl in the hat and cloak, the chipmunks in the boots, and so on. That's rather a step back to mucking about to music.
And then each of them is able to go and tell their parent or guardian that they've met someone they'd like to marry, and then that's all they'll say. Clearly, because Mary Costa and Bill Shirley came and recorded what lines they could, and then weren't available or weren't considered worth getting back again while they finalised the script. And one of my favourite factoids, apart from the Mel Blanc hiccup thing, is that Aurora is the eponymous Disney character with the fewest lines apart from Dumbo. And the finale is the three fairies, Maleficent, a little bit of King Hubert, people that will drop everything for Disney at a moment's notice, talking through whatever Philip and or Aurora are doing with no voices, just the animation. Towards the very end, the fairies are breaking Philip out of Maleficent's prison, and Flora goes, "Shh, Prince Philip," and we're like, "Don't worry, he will be."
It's an interesting phenomenon, and perhaps in some ways a problem, that it really is a film about the three fairies. They're undoubtedly the characters featured in it most and with the most lines, and really they do drive the whole thing. After Maleficent's come and done her curse, and Merryweather has mitigated it with her gift, really the fairies are driving everything. They decide to live as three peasant women in the woods to raise Aurora as Briar Rose. They then mess up that plan by revealing that the cottage has got magic going on in it to Maleficent's evil bird companion by mucking about, firing sparks out of the chimney. Now, if they'd just done that sequence quietly and sensibly, made a cake and a dress for a birthday surprise without making each other pink and blue, they'd have got away with it and would have been fine. It was entirely their stupidity that revealed their location to the crow. The fairies then, after Maleficent's curse has been fulfilled, decide to put everyone to sleep. Then they go to Maleficent's castle to rescue Prince Philip, as you were talking about, and bring him back, help him back to kiss Aurora, and of course kill Maleficent on the way, using the shield of righteousness and the sword of truth that Flora the fairy has provided, and using little bits of their magic along the way to help him with the various obstacles. Merryweather turns the crow to stone, which is rather fun.
Yes, she earlier on wanted to turn Maleficent into a big old hot toad, and gets told, "Oh, we can't do that, we only do good things to make people happy." Well, that would make me happy, she says, and I think, yes, and probably a lot of other people too. That's probably quite a good use of your magic, seeing the things that she does.
We were discussing how the good fairies probably can't go directly to Maleficent and take her on magic to magic. That's not how their power works. But with a good and righteous heart, Prince Philip, their magic can help to defeat evil through him and through his determination to use the power of love to defeat evil.
Merryweather really has got the most character of the three and is the most engaging, I think, and puts the most life into those sequences.
And Fauna is the least engaging and characterful fairy, I think. Although she does do the funniest bit of the birthday surprise in the cottage sequence, which I've always really enjoyed, which involves trying to make the birthday cake, and it's funny enough when she's trying to do 3 cups of flour and all the cups are different sizes. But then when she's got the whole thing iced and candled and it's collapsing all over the place, she comes out with, "It'll be much stiffer after it's baked." She hasn't baked it, and yet it's all ice and got candles on it. And really, Merryweather in that scene is the voice of reason to say we should be using the wand. Of course, they end up using them foolishly and fighting and creating the problem that then has to be solved for the rest of the movie. But Merryweather's right in principle. They should have stuffed up the windows and quietly used the wands, played to their strengths to make this birthday surprise. Otherwise, they're just going to make a total mess of it. And there's a good lesson there about using the skills you have in an appropriate and measured fashion to achieve your goals and not muck about trying to do it in other ways to try to prove a point or satisfy yourself or other people.
Getting back to Philip and his defeat of Maleficent, she falls from a height, of course, with a sword in her chest, as a dragon.
When I was little, I found it quite effectively threatening. Now you'll have to face me, O Prince, and all the powers of hell. And I'm like, oh, that sounds daunting. But of course, truth and justice and true love can overcome the powers of evil very easily.
It's the true love aspect, isn't it, that meant they really felt they had to forego the 100 years element. They make a very peculiar reference to it when Maleficent's telling the silent Philip and giving him a vision. I'll let you out in 100 years and you'll be all old and saggy.
And so will Samson, your horse.
But then the fairies come and get him out and he does all this the same night, and I find that a little bit disappointing. I don't know how I would have done it. Perhaps if I'd been there in 1959 on the team, I'd have been able to think of something. I think it's a shame not to find a way to freeze Philip and have her sleep for the 100 years. There ought to have been a way around it, but then they were obviously really having some trouble getting any kind of script together at all.
They put in the Forest of Thorns as homage to the original fairy tale as well, and instead of growing up around the castle during the 100 years, it's an obstacle that Maleficent shocks in and is quite quickly dealt with. So it kind of pays a bit of lip service to the fairy tale in an attempt to get in these things that it's not going to be using exactly as they are in the source material.
Talking of lip service, a way in which values and ideology have changed is that nowadays, if you read some kind of retelling for an adult audience or a very small child audience, you're likely to read that the prince wakes the princess up just by entering the room. She wakes up going, "Oh, what's that?" Because it's not acceptable for him to kiss her while she's unconscious. But a very interesting thing is that lately I've been reading Andrew Lang's colour fairy books from the 19th century. Perhaps that's not very interesting to you, but there are a lot of interesting things in these books. And one of them is that in his version of Sleeping Beauty, that's what happens. The prince comes in, makes a bit of a noise with the door, and she wakes up and goes, "Oh, hello." And he doesn't kiss her. So if you do read a modern version like that, you can remember that Andrew Lang thinks that's how it happened as well. Of course, in the Disney movie, a kiss is much more satisfying. Same thing happened in Snow White, really. In the original Snow White, you don't kiss her, as you said. You drop her coffin and dislodge the poison apple from her throat. But in the Disney movie, they go for true love's kiss, or love's first kiss, or something like that.
The 17th entry on the list is 101 Dalmatians from 1961. We actually turned down the opportunity to watch this in our DVD watch through just now, because I think we both always found it rather boring.
I think that's fair to say, and I also think no one would contest that the most memorable aspect of that movie is Cruella de Vil. When Buster and Babs are taking off the 101 Dalmatians, the aspect of it that they really use is the Cruella de Vil character. She has a very striking look and a very striking villainous motivation. She wants to turn puppies into coats. That's horrible. And rather like Peter Pan, really, there are certain things you can take away, and if you actually watch the movie, you'll find there's not really any more to it than that. And actually, I don't find Cruella de Vil half as interesting as I find the interesting aspects of Peter Pan.
18th on the list is The Sword in the Stone 1963, which we talked about in some detail in our Camelot podcast. And we discussed there how we're starting to get into the realms of being a bit lazy, as Disney himself does become a bit less involved reusing animation sequences within the same movie. Then, of course, as we get into the 70s with things like Robin Hood, they start getting bits out of other movies that they've already made and reusing the animation from those.
This reminds me that 101 Dalmatians is the point where the animation starts to look a bit rough. I really noticed when we watched Lady and the Tramp how clean and nice it looked. And somewhere in the back of my mind was 101 Dalmatians isn't like that, is it? It's more like The Sword in the Stone, the Jungle Book. So if Disney himself is less involved after he said no more fairy tales and can't quite be bothered anymore, that would account for it.
I was reading a list of crew on Disney movies in one of those tables like they make on Wikipedia. And obviously, with the early ones, Walt Disney's very heavily involved in quite a few crew roles. But by the time we get to the 60s, 101 Dalmatians, The Sword in the Stone, The Jungle Book, he is only listed as producer, which really means his team is making the movies and they're coming to him with ideas and he's saying, yes, no, let's do it this way, let's not do it this way, and then they go off and put that into the movie, at least to some extent.
I learned that for definite from a special feature on a DVD of The Jungle Book. They were showing me concept art of the vultures, who in some form did make it into that movie, and a sort of comedy rhino character that Walt said no to.
And of course, The Jungle Book is the last movie that Walt Disney personally worked on, and is therefore, for the sake of this podcast, the end of the classic Disney era. Waltz died in late 1966. The movie was released in 1967. And while we were watching it just before making this podcast, I remarked I very much doubt Walt Disney saw a final cut of this before he died. He'd have been quite appalled by all the reused animation sequences. The whole elephant march is in it twice. Bagheera reacting is in it about 3 times.
Mowgli's laugh, I noticed a couple of times, and in fact I think one of the vultures had Mowgli's laugh as well.
And my overall verdict on The Jungle Book was a bit boring and a bit stupid. Not boring and stupid to the extent of something like Fantasia, where you object to its very existence. But still, I thought, well, I can go without seeing this again.
I've read a long time ago now The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling and found it boring. And given the dryness of Kipling's writing style, I can see exactly what happened with the Disney movie. They took the characters and tried to liven them up a bit, but still, I don't think it was really quite enough for me. The most interesting thing for me in The Jungle Book, the book, and The Jungle Book, the movie, is the realism of the interaction between the jungle animals. They're all frightened of Shere Khan, except for the elephants, who only really start to think about him if someone points out that their baby might be in danger. Animals such as Kaa the python and the vultures feel fairly confident that he's not going to bother doing anything to them, but they don't want to annoy him because they know that he could. Bagheera, the leopard, sleeps up a tree for his own safety, and you can imagine him dragging his prey up there so that Shere Khan can't get it when he happens to be around.
When Shere Khan's stalking that deer to introduce, oh, he's evil, isn't he? You were saying, well, he's just trying to eat. And I said Bagheera must have very similar prey to Shere Khan. They're just doing what they do.
That's the trouble with him as a villain, isn't it? He's, as you were saying, just an apex predator, and he has good reason to fear man and want to snuff out Mowgli before he becomes a man.
And the whole deleted sequence where it ends up with Mowgli shoots Shere Khan to kill him, I'm glad was omitted and never animated. Shere Khan is just a tiger doing what he does. He doesn't deserve a Disney villain death. And if Mowgli ends up being the man that Shere Khan fears and shooting him in the face, Shere Khan is proved right. Much better to let Mowgli find his way into the human community, there to grow up into the person he's going to be, rather than be forced to be a threat immediately. And better that Shere Khan goes off, no longer a threat, but not having been killed as a Disney villain, because he's not really a villain, just an antagonist.
When we saw Captain Hook getting chased into the horizon by the crocodile, it reminded me very much of Shere Khan, who also runs off screen in a perilous situation. But he even more definitely survives than Captain Hook, because he's running away from some fire that's attached to his tail, and as soon as he's over the horizon it starts raining, so that's going to put the fire out, isn't it? We do have to mention a couple of characters that we haven't. First of all, King Louis, who I don't find particularly striking myself, but it's a very famous Ooby-Doo, I want to be like you sequence, isn't it?
That had a lot of the silliest bits, not only the dancing, but Baloo and King Louis holding up the ruins and things. That was my least favourite part of the film, I think.
And then the other character you just mentioned, Baloo, whom I was pleased to see when we watched it, and I said, oh good, Baloo, because even though he hasn't got the most engaging things to do, like he has as Little John in Robin Hood, I like to hear Phil Harris with his bear voice, singing his Bare Necessities song, and just livening things up a bit.
It was interesting to see in the opening credits, wasn't it, how The Bare Necessities was written by and composed by a different person than all the other songs in it, the very forgettable songs in it.
Of course, it's Baloo and King Louis, who were in a sort of alternate universe spin-off, Tailspin, which I saw before I ever saw The Jungle Book, and I was a bit surprised to see Baloo, who I thought was a pilot with an aeroplane and clothes, being a more regular kind of bear in The Jungle Book. And King Louis ran the bar, and I don't know if he was antagonistic in it at all. It doesn't sound like he was if he ran a bar.
I think he wasn't. I think I was quite surprised seeing The Jungle Book for the first time. Oh, King Louis is a sort of baddie or sinister character. He's supposed to be a friendly barman. Apparently they wanted Phil Harris to voice Baloo in Tailspin, but he discovered he couldn't quite do it. He was in his late 80s.
But whatever made anybody think that those two characters from The Jungle Book would make a good series about anthropomorphic animals flying aeroplanes?
Interestingly enough, there is a third character from The Jungle Book in that series occasionally. Shere Khan is a kind of evil businessman who sits behind a desk and tries to buy up the airfield or something like that.
What would Rudyard Kipling say to that, I wonder?
And in Tailspin, his voice is being done by Tony Jay, who we've mentioned a few times in the podcast. And as we know, he did do a lot of voiceovers in the 90s and the noughties before he died, including as Frollo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame for Disney. There's kind of more homage to The Jungle Book in Tailspin, where Baloo calls the kid character, who's called Kit Cloudkicker, Little Britches, like he calls Mowgli, and Kit in return calls him Papa Bear. The voices in the Jungle Book movie are quite interesting because you've got Phil Harris joining the Disney family. More work to come there, as we know, appropriately as Little John and less appropriately as Thomas O'Malley.
And chiefly, it seems to me, they find out that they like to make him say beautiful. And that is quite a nice word to hear him say, I agree with them.
Bagheera is voiced by Sebastian Cabot, who was Sir Ector in The Sword and the Stone, and only when Bagheera gets very agitated and cross does he start to remind one of Sir Ector in his deliveries. There's Clint Howard, Ron Howard's little brother, as the young elephant. That was an interesting snippet I read. As was mentioned in our Alice in Wonderland podcast, Sterling Holloway is on duty again, this time as Car, the python, in a role that's perhaps a little too sinister for him.
That sequence, Trust in Me, where he's hypnotised Mowgli into walking off the tree and he catches him and makes steps out of his body and stuff, I was saying to you earlier, could be a metaphor for these controlling parents who support you for a while, all in the build-up to crushing you in their coils when they're quite ready.
We always thought those vultures' voices were rather weird because they're kind of doing Beatles impressions, and yet they sing as a barbershop quartet.
And I saw in one of these special features that the plan was to have them sing their song in the style of the Beatles, and I thought, well, that makes much more sense. Why didn't they stick with that?
Wolfgang Reitherman was mentioned in our Camelot podcast as the director of The Sword in the Stone, and two of his sons were brought in to be two of the three voices of Arthur Wart. It was interesting to spot that Wolfgang really did move his way up the Disney ranks. Even on Snow White, he was doing some less glorious work, effects animation, and poor old Dan McManus, we noticed, never worked his way up out of of effects animation. Perhaps he liked it. But Wooly Reitherman, or Wolfgang Reitherman as he's credited later, works his way right up to director for The Sword in the Stone, as we know, and also The Jungle Book. And as I'm sure we mentioned when talking about him before, his third son, Bruce Reitherman, is the voice of Mowgli in The Jungle Book.
Really, it's a challenging role, isn't it? You were pointing out that Mowgli doesn't work very well as a protagonist. He's just a focal point for the animals, who are the real main characters.
Yes, that was really striking me this time. They put a lot of time and thought into the animals and what they're going to do and what they're going to be like. And Mowgli is really only there to facilitate that, which I think is particularly challenging as a role to interpret. And I think, given those limitations, Bruce Reitherman did a very good job with it, because he did manage to make a noticeable impressions on scenes where he's singing with Baloo and standing up to Shere Khan and talking to Bagheera about how he doesn't want to leave the jungle, and he does manage to bring through Mowgli's feelings and motivations and not make him completely flat as a character, even though his role as a protagonist is compromised by how the film is structured.
You know, we weren't planning on mentioning the crappy new live-action movies at all, but I want to now mention The Jungle Book because that's a very interesting parallel. The young actor playing Mowgli in the live-action/CG remake also has an insurmountable challenge on his hands, being a young actor with no other actors to play off. And in fact, I think he doesn't quite get there and doesn't make Mowgli engaging enough, which doesn't really matter anyway because the whole film is a steaming pile of horse crap. And I don't want to sound detrimental because I think he does the best that any child could in that situation.
Our next podcast will be our 2021 update podcast, which will be with you one Sunday in January 2022. Not sure which one yet, but it will certainly be up by the last Sunday. After that, on the final Sunday in February 2022, our next regular podcast will be released, and that will be about
certain adaptations of the true history of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII and all that.
Good night out there.
Whatever you are.